Imagine a nation caught in the grip of unimaginable hardship, where everyday life became a battle for survival. Greece, in the early 1940s, faced a nightmare unlike any other, a country under Nazi occupation, its people starving, entire villages destroyed, and countless lives uprooted or lost forever. The streets of Athens, once bustling with life, grew silent as fear and uncertainty took hold. Families scavenged for scraps. Neighbors looked on helplessly as loved ones were taken away, and the hum of normal life was replaced by the haunting echoes of loss. But Greece was not a nation that would surrender easily. The resilience of its people became evident in the mountains, the villages, and the hidden corners where hope refused to die, even as the Nazis imposed strict controls. Demanding food, resources, and labor from an already struggling population, ordinary Greeks found ways to resist, to protect one another, and to hold on to the essence of their culture and identity. This was a time when courage was measured not in grand victories, but in small acts of defiance, sharing a loaf of bread, hiding a neighbor from patrols, or passing secret messages through the shadows of the city. At the heart of this story is a complex figure. Yannis Rallis, a man whose choices would shape the destiny of millions. Some saw him as a protector against political upheaval, others as a collaborator whose decisions brought suffering. His leadership during this dark period is a study in moral ambiguity, the kind that forces us to ask difficult questions about loyalty, patriotism, and the cost of survival under occupation. Throughout this narrative, we will explore the layers of history that defined Greece during World War II, the famine that claimed hundreds of thousands, the relentless deportations of Jewish communities, and the rise of resistance movements determined to reclaim their homeland. We will uncover stories of bravery, tragedy, and moral complexity, showing not just the events that unfolded, but the human spirit that endured against all odds. If you want to understand the profound impact of this period on Greece, and the lessons it holds for courage, resilience, and moral decision-making, stay with us until the end. Hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications so you do not miss any of our deep dives into history's most compelling stories. Together, we will journey through the struggles and triumphs of a nation under siege, learning from the past to better understand the present. Welcome to the story of Greece's darkest hours, where every choice mattered and every life told a story of endurance. As the shadow of occupation stretched across Greece, the country found itself not only battling the external threat of Nazi forces, but also grappling with internal divisions that had long simmered beneath the surface. In this turbulent landscape emerged Yannis Rallis, a man whose name would become synonymous with one of the most controversial periods in modern Greek history. Born into a family steeped in political tradition, Rallis had spent much of his life navigating the intricate corridors of power in Athens, understanding the delicate balance between the monarchy, the military, and the rising tide of political ideologies that threatened the status quo. By the time the German army made its inexorable advance into Greek territory, he was positioned to make choices that would define not only his legacy, but the fate of an entire nation. Rallis was a conservative and a royalist, deeply wary of the growing influence of the Communist Party, which had begun to attract widespread support amid the social and economic turbulence of the time. For him, the communist movement represented not just a political challenge, but an existential threat to the traditional structures of Greek society and the monarchy that had long guided the nation. This fear, combined with his understanding of the precariousness of Greece's military and political situation, would ultimately lead him down a path of collaboration with the occupying forces, a decision he justified publicly as a necessary measure to prevent Greece from falling into the hands of communism. Yet, beneath this rationale lay a more complex reality. one where moral compromise and the calculus of survival intertwined in ways that would haunt the country for decades to come. The puppet government Rallis led was framed as a guardian of Greek interests, a shield against the chaos that many feared would follow if left unchecked. The narrative he advanced was that collaboration with the Nazis, harsh and morally fraught though it appeared, was a means of protecting Greece from a political upheaval that could be just as devastating as foreign occupation. In practice, this rationale manifested in the creation of the Security Battalions, paramilitary groups trained and equipped to target communist partisans and enforce the decrees of the German authorities. Men who joined these battalions swore oaths of loyalty not to Greece but to Adolf Hitler, a stark illustration of the moral and political compromises at play. Despite Rallis' insistence that these forces were defending the nation, their operations often brought misery to ordinary citizens, creating a climate of fear and distrust in villages and towns across the occupied territories. Families were torn apart as neighbors were forced to make impossible choices, deciding between survival and loyalty, safety and principle. Yet Rallis' position was not simply one of blind allegiance. It was shaped by a strategic calculation that aimed to navigate the extraordinarily complex web of occupation politics. He understood that Germany, though dominant, was not invincible, and that the tides of war could shift. He also recognized the fragmented nature of resistance movements in Greece, which were not united under a single banner but divided among nationalist, liberal, socialist, and communist factions. For Rallis, the rise of communism within these movements represented a threat that could persist long after the Nazis were gone. This perspective led him to double down on his anti-communist policies, seeking to suppress leftist influence even as his government facilitated the machinery of occupation, which included the extraction of resources and the enforcement of harsh policies that left civilians starving and vulnerable. In the broader context of Greece's wartime experience, Rallis' actions highlight the moral ambiguity that so often accompanies survival under occupation. On one hand, his justification of anti-communism and preservation of the state resonated with segments of the population who feared the chaos that radical political change might bring. On the other hand, his collaboration enabled atrocities, including the deportation of Jews from Thessalonica and Athens, the widespread famine that claimed hundreds of thousands of lives, and the brutal reprisals against resistance fighters and ordinary villagers alike. The choices he made reflected a tension between political pragmatism and ethical responsibility, a tension that would leave a permanent mark on the national conscience and fuel debates about collaboration, resistance, and the costs of survival. Rallis' tenure also serves as a lens through which to understand the complexity of Greek society during this period. The collaborationist government he led was not monolithic. It operated within a fragile ecosystem of competing interests, shifting alliances, and the constant pressure of occupying forces. The Security Battalions, ostensibly created to enforce anti-communist policies, were often caught in a web of conflicting objectives, balancing the demands of Nazi authorities with local realities. Ordinary Greeks navigated these pressures daily, finding ways to resist in small, clandestine acts or, in some cases, to cooperate reluctantly to ensure survival. In this environment, the line between heroism and complicity became blurred, and the legacy of Rallis' decisions would continue to shape perceptions of morality, patriotism, and leadership long after the war had ended. Through this story, the figure of Yannis Rallis emerges not simply as a collaborator, but as a symbol of the difficult, morally charged choices that arise when a nation is besieged on multiple fronts. His focus on anti-communism, while understandable within his worldview, demonstrates the perils of allowing ideological fears to dictate decisions in times of extreme crisis. It reminds us that leadership under occupation is rarely clear-cut, and that the consequences of political compromise extend far beyond the immediate moment. affecting the lives of millions and leaving historical questions that defy easy answers. By examining Rallis' decisions and their consequences, we gain a deeper understanding of Greece's wartime experience, not just as a narrative of occupation and resistance, but as a human story of fear, calculation, moral complexity, and the struggle to preserve a nation amid forces that threatened to tear it apart. It is a story that challenges us to consider the costs of political choices, the weight of moral responsibility, and the enduring tension between survival and principle. In the end, Rallis' legacy serves as both a warning and a lesson, illustrating how even those who believe they are protecting their country can become complicit in suffering when ideology and expedience outweigh ethical consideration. And it underscores why the human dimension of history is as crucial as the political and military narratives that dominate our understanding of the past. In the shadow of the Nazi occupation, Greece was not only confronting the external forces that had swept across its mountains and cities, but also the fractures within its own society, where ideology and survival collided in ways that would leave a lasting mark on the nation's memory. At the center of this maelstrom was Yannis Rallis, whose determination to suppress communism became the driving force behind one of the most controversial elements of his government, the Security Battalions. Conceived as paramilitary units loyal to the occupying powers, these battalions were framed by Rallis as a necessary instrument to maintain order, combat insurgents, and protect the state from what he saw as the looming threat of communist domination. Yet in practice, their operations quickly revealed the devastating consequences of conflating political fear with military enforcement, as the battalions became agents of terror whose actions rippled through the civilian population with lethal efficiency and moral ambiguity. The security battalions were not merely symbolic. They were trained, armed, and instructed to root out communist partisans, enforce curfews, and maintain the Nazi-imposed order. Men who joined these forces swore loyalty not to Greece but to the occupiers themselves, a chilling reflection of the moral compromises required by collaboration. Once mobilized, their presence transformed the Greek countryside and urban centers alike into landscapes of suspicion and fear. Villagers lived under constant threat, knowing that any act of resistance, whether real or perceived, could trigger violent reprisals. Families hid what little food they had, whispered messages across fences, and attempted to shield loved ones from arbitrary detentions or brutal interrogations. The battalions, while justified in the rhetoric of anti-communism, became an extension of occupation, enforcing policies that often exacerbated the very suffering Rallis claimed to prevent. The battalion's impact on ordinary citizens was profound and immediate. Farmers found themselves subject to punitive measures if supplies or livestock were diverted to support partisan activity, sometimes facing confiscation or violent punishment. In towns and cities, arrests were frequent, often targeting not only suspected communists but anyone who dared to oppose the imposed order or resist the occupiers in subtle ways. Entire communities learned the harsh lesson that ideological enforcement, when combined with military authority, could swiftly erode social cohesion and trust. Neighbors were pitted against neighbors, and a pervasive atmosphere of fear settled over the country, compounding the anguish caused by famine, occupation, and the ever-present threat of deportation. Yet even within this grim reality, the story of the security battalions is not devoid of complexity. Rallis' intentions, as he publicly stated, were rooted in a belief that communism could destabilize Greece long after the German army withdrew. From his perspective, the battalions were a preventive measure, designed to safeguard a vision of Greece aligned with monarchy and tradition, and to forestall a post-war power struggle that might leave the country under a regime he feared. However, in translating this ideological concern into action, the battalions became a mechanism through which ordinary Greeks experienced the brutality of occupation firsthand. The distinction between preserving order and perpetrating terror blurred, and in the process, Rallis' vision of patriotic duty collided tragically with the human cost of enforcement. The battalion's operations also interacted with the larger narrative of resistance in ways that magnified their impact. Across the mountains and villages, partisan groups divided among nationalist, liberal, socialist, and communist factions were already mobilizing to challenge the occupiers, the security battalions. In targeting the communist elements within these groups, inadvertently fueled tensions within the broader resistance movement. While their stated goal was to prevent a communist takeover, their actions sometimes strengthened the resolve of partisan forces, who saw in the battalions a symbol of both occupation and betrayal by fellow Greeks. This dynamic created a complex battlefield, one in which ideological struggle and the fight for national liberation became inseparable, and where the civilian population often bore the heaviest burden. Stories from this period illustrate the human consequences of these policies in vivid detail. In remote villages, families were rounded up for suspicion of aiding partisans. Homes were burned as warnings, and entire communities were forced to witness acts of reprisal meant to intimidate others into compliance. Children watched as their parents were questioned or beaten, and communities lived under a constant calculus of fear, measuring every action against potential consequences imposed by the battalions. At the same time, the moral dilemmas faced by ordinary soldiers and villagers created a profound sense of tension. Many men conscripted into these units were themselves struggling with loyalty to family, community, and country, caught between the pressures of authority and the instincts of conscience. The legacy of the security battalions is thus a story of moral complexity, illustrating how measures justified under the guise of national defense can have consequences far beyond their intended scope. Their creation and actions reflect the perilous intersection of ideology, occupation, and governance, highlighting the dangers inherent when fear and political calculation dictate the exercise of power. For Greece, the battalions became emblematic of the internal fractures that accompanied external domination, a reminder that even in the fight for survival, ethical boundaries are tested, and the line between protector and oppressor can shift in ways that leave lasting scars. By examining the rise and impact of the security battalions, we gain insight not only into the strategies employed by Rallis and his government, but also into the lived experience of civilians navigating life under extreme duress. The battalion's story underscores the human cost of ideological enforcement and the fragile balance between power, fear, and morality during occupation. It reminds us that the choices of a few can reverberate through the lives of many, shaping the narrative of a nation in ways that endure long after the immediate threats have passed, and that history is often defined not just by battles and policies, but by the intricate, sometimes tragic, human stories that unfold within them. As the winds of war swept across Europe, Greece found itself at the crossroads of destiny, a nation whose fate would be tested not only by foreign invaders, but also by the internal fractures that had been building for years. In October 1940, the Italian army, emboldened by Mussolini's ambitions and confident in its might, launched an invasion from Albania, seeking to extend fascist control into the Balkans and establish dominance over Greece. On paper, the Greek army was vastly outnumbered, lacking the tanks, heavy artillery, and mechanized forces that characterized modern warfare. And yet, what seemed an impossible task became a defining moment in the nation's history. The Greek people, driven by a fierce sense of national pride and a determination to defend their homeland, took to the mountains, the valleys, and the winding roads with a resolve that would soon astonish the world. The initial clash with the Italians unfolded in the rugged terrain of northern Greece, where the defenders' intimate knowledge of their homeland became an unexpected advantage. Greek soldiers, many of them conscripts familiar with the harsh mountain landscapes, maneuvered with agility and resourcefulness, using the geography to offset the technological superiority of their foes. Small, determined units carried out ambushes, executed rapid counterattacks, and leveraged the element of surprise, turning what could have been a straightforward invasion into a campaign marked by uncertainty and setbacks for the Italians. In towns and villages, civilians supported these efforts in whatever ways they could, supplying food, shelter, and intelligence to the troops, creating a network of resilience that intertwined the military and the population in a shared struggle for survival. The victory that emerged from this confrontation was not only military but also symbolic. Within 6 weeks, the Greek army had pushed the Italians back across the border into Albania, marking the first significant victory for the Allies in the Second World War. While the broader European theatre was dominated by German advances and apparent Axis invincibility, Greece's success resonated as a beacon of resistance and courage. Newspapers around the world reported on the unexpected triumph, highlighting not merely the tactical achievements but the extraordinary determination and morale of the Greek forces. For the Greek people, this victory was a moment of national pride, a demonstration that even against overwhelming odds, unity, strategy, and sheer willpower could yield results that defied expectations. At the heart of this story were the ordinary men and women who made extraordinary sacrifices. Soldiers fought in harsh conditions, often with limited supplies, enduring freezing nights in the mountains and hunger that mirrored the struggles faced by civilians back home. In urban areas, life continued amid the anxiety of war, as families sent sons and fathers to the front lines and found ways to support the resistance in small, courageous acts. Each ambush, each repelled attack, and each strategic maneuver was a testament to a society that refused to be conquered by fear, demonstrating that resilience was not solely the domain of generals or politicians, but lived in the daily choices of every individual willing to defend their homeland. This victory also had profound political and strategic implications, illustrating the vulnerability of fascist ambitions when met with determination and local knowledge. Italy's failure to subdue Greece not only disrupted Mussolini's plans but also drew the attention of Adolf Hitler, who had initially planned his operations in Eastern Europe without immediate involvement in the Balkans. The Greeks' ability to repel the Italians forced a recalibration of Axis strategy, introducing delays and complications that would ripple across subsequent campaigns. In this context, the actions of the Greek army transcended national significance, influencing the broader course of the war and demonstrating how local resistance could impact global strategy. Yet, amid these triumphs, the seeds of future challenges were also sown. The victory over the Italians, while remarkable, did not end the threat of occupation. It merely postponed it. The German army, recognizing both the strategic importance of Greece and the vulnerability of its ally, eventually launched its own invasion, overwhelming the defenses that had so recently celebrated success. Nevertheless, the memory of the Italian defeat endured as a symbol of Greek tenacity, a reminder that courage, ingenuity, and unity could overcome even the most daunting odds. It provided a psychological foundation for the resistance that would emerge during the subsequent years of occupation, fueling the determination of partisans, civilians, and even hesitant allies to continue fighting for freedom despite overwhelming adversity. The triumph against the Italians also illuminated the interplay between national pride and individual courage. Soldiers who had faced near-impossible conditions carried the morale of a nation on their shoulders, their actions inspiring civilians and creating a sense of shared destiny. Families who had watched their loved ones depart for the front experienced moments of hope and relief as reports of victories filtered back, reinforcing the belief that survival and defiance were intertwined. In this way, the military success of 1940 was inseparable from the social and cultural fabric of Greece. a collective effort that showcased how ordinary citizens and soldiers together could forge a legacy of resistance that would echo through history. The lessons of this period, therefore, extend beyond the tactical or strategic. They speak to the enduring power of resilience in the face of overwhelming challenges, the importance of unity amid diversity, and the capacity for human courage to defy expectations. Greece's initial repulsion of the Italian invasion stands not only as a historical fact, but as a narrative of hope, perseverance, and the extraordinary potential of a nation determined to protect its sovereignty and identity. It reminds us that even in the darkest hours, the combination of determination, strategy, and collective effort can yield victories that resonate far beyond the battlefield, shaping the moral and cultural memory of a people for generations to come. This story, woven into the larger narrative of occupation, collaboration, and resistance, sets the stage for the profound struggles and moral dilemmas that would follow, illustrating the complexity of leadership, the resilience of a nation, and the sacrifices that define the human experience in times of war. And it invites us to reflect on the courage and determination that enabled Greece to claim its first victory in a conflict that would engulf the world. By the spring of 1941, the landscape of Europe had been dramatically reshaped by the ferocity of the Axis powers. And Greece, which had tasted the elation of early victories against the Italians, now faced a far graver threat that would test the very limits of its military and civilian endurance. The Italian defeat had not only humiliated Mussolini, but also drawn the watchful eyes of Adolf Hitler, whose strategic ambitions in the Balkans and concern over British influence could no longer be ignored. The German High Command, already preparing for its monumental campaign against the Soviet Union, recognized that the southern flank of Europe could not remain a loose end. A rapid and decisive intervention was planned, one that would exploit the weaknesses left by Greece's previous engagements. And on April 6, 1941, the German war machine descended upon the nation with an intensity that few could have anticipated. The invasion, swift and meticulously orchestrated, demonstrated the terrifying efficiency of the Wehrmacht. Air superiority was established within hours, with Luftwaffe squadrons executing precision bombings on airfields, supply depots, and communication hubs, effectively paralyzing the Greek and Allied command structures before they could mount an organized defense. Mechanized units, supported by tanks and mobile artillery, advanced along multiple axes, their movements coordinated to encircle and isolate Greek divisions while preventing reinforcements from consolidating in the north or south. Despite the valor of Greek troops and the support of British, Australian, and New Zealand contingents, the sheer speed and coordination of the German assault left the defenders in a constant reactive posture, forced to contend with relentless pressure and a rapidly deteriorating tactical situation. As the German forces advanced, the human dimension of the invasion came sharply into focus. Civilians, already accustomed to the hardships of occupation and rationing, now faced the terror of aerial bombardment and the sudden arrival of mechanized units in their towns and villages. Families fled their homes with what possessions they could carry, seeking refuge in mountains, caves, and sparsely populated countryside, where survival depended as much on courage as on luck. The Greek army, though brave and determined, was gradually outmaneuvered, its defensive lines stretched thin, its resources depleted, and its soldiers exhausted from months of continuous operations against the Italians. Reports of heroic stands in mountain passes and urban strongpoints circulated, yet each small victory was overshadowed by the inexorable march of the German advance. The contrast between the Italian and German campaigns highlighted the harsh realities of modern warfare. While the Greek army's intimate knowledge of local terrain had been decisive against the Italians, the mechanized precision, aerial support, and logistical superiority of the German forces created a battlefield where traditional advantages were nullified. Greek units, often fighting valiantly in encircled positions or attempting to delay superior forces through strategic withdrawals, faced a form of warfare that was both unfamiliar and devastatingly effective. The Allies, despite their best efforts, were limited in numbers and constrained by the need to maintain broader commitments across the Mediterranean theater, and soon their positions were increasingly untenable. In this environment of escalating conflict, the psychological impact on both soldiers and civilians was profound. News of successive German breakthroughs spread rapidly, creating a climate of uncertainty and fear. Communities that had recently celebrated Greek resilience against the Italians now confronted the terrifying reality that their country could be entirely overtaken. Amid these pressures, acts of courage persisted. Small groups of resistance fighters attempted sabotage. Villagers hid refugees, and soldiers conducted rearguard actions to slow the enemy's progress. Yet the momentum of the German blitzkrieg was relentless, leaving a trail of destruction. Disrupted infrastructure and displaced populations in its wake. Strategically, the invasion underscored the broader implications of Axis coordination. The German advance into Greece not only neutralized a potential British foothold in the Balkans, but also secured vital lines of communication and resources that would be essential for subsequent operations, including the campaign against Crete and the planned assault on the Soviet Union. Hitler's calculation that rapid domination of Greece would preclude protracted resistance and protect his southern flank reflected both a military pragmatism and a disregard for the human cost, as the tactics employed relied on overwhelming force, speed, and intimidation. For Greece, the campaign became a test of endurance, resilience, and national identity, illustrating how a smaller nation could be drawn into the wider currents of global conflict and forced to navigate challenges far beyond its immediate control. Even as the German forces pressed forward, individual stories of resistance and sacrifice continued to emerge, providing a counterpoint to the overwhelming scale of the invasion. Soldiers defending isolated villages, civilians risking everything to deliver food or intelligence, and partisans preparing for clandestine operations all contributed to a narrative of defiance that would sustain the Greek spirit throughout the occupation. These human dimensions remind us that history is not only shaped by armies and strategies but also by the courage, ingenuity, and resilience of ordinary people confronting extraordinary circumstances. Within a matter of weeks, the situation became clear. Athens, Thessalonica, and other key urban centers fell under German control, and the Greek and allied forces, battered and exhausted, were forced into retreat toward coastal ports for evacuation. Equipment was destroyed to prevent capture, but the human cost of this strategic withdrawal was immense, leaving behind a country effectively under foreign dominion and a population bracing for the realities of occupation. The rapid conquest by Germany contrasted starkly with the earlier victory against Italy, emphasizing how different scales of power, strategy, and technological capability could decisively alter the outcome of conflicts, regardless of bravery or determination. Yet even in defeat, the narrative of April 1941 set the stage for resistance, collaboration, and moral reckoning. The German invasion, while overwhelming, could not extinguish the determination of the Greek people. It created conditions in which leadership, collaboration, ideological struggle, and the emerging partisan movements would intersect in complex and often tragic ways. The occupation that followed would be defined not only by the policies of puppet governments and the enforcement of security battalions, but also by the enduring resilience of ordinary Greeks, whose responses, whether in covert resistance, survival, or accommodation shaped the trajectory of the nation and the memory of the conflict for generations. In examining the German invasion of Greece in April 1941, one sees both the mechanics of modern warfare and the human stories that accompany it. The rapid advance of mechanized units, the impact of air superiority, and the decisive outcomes of military planning, but also the courage of soldiers, the fear of civilians, and the emergence of resistance in the face of overwhelming force. This pivotal moment serves as a lens through which we understand the complex interplay between power, strategy, and human experience, illustrating how a nation, though swiftly overtaken, could preserve its identity, spirit, and hope even amid the profound disruptions of war. Even as mainland Greece fell under the heavy boots of German occupation, the island of Crete became the stage for a confrontation that would etch itself into the annals of military history, a story of defiance, courage, and remarkable resilience that showcased the indomitable spirit of the Greek people. Following the swift conquest of Athens and Thessalonica, Hitler turned his attention to Crete, recognizing the island's strategic importance in controlling the eastern Mediterranean and securing vital supply lines, while also aiming to eliminate any remaining Allied footholds. In May 1941, Operation Mercury was launched, marking the largest airborne assault attempted up to that time, and the Germans committed some of their elite paratroopers to seize the key objectives, including the strategically crucial airfields, ports, and urban centers. What they had not fully anticipated, however, was the extraordinary resistance they would encounter from both Allied forces and the island's civilian population, whose determination to defend their homeland transformed the invasion into a protracted and bloody ordeal. From the moment German transport planes cut through the dawn sky, the defenders of Crete sprang into action. Greek soldiers, bolstered by British, Australian, and New Zealand troops who had been stationed on the island after evacuating the mainland, mobilized to confront the incoming paratroopers, who descended with speed and precision, but were initially scattered by the mountainous terrain and unpredictable wind conditions. The paratroopers faced immediate resistance, not only from trained soldiers but from local civilians who had taken up arms in an unprecedented display of communal defense. Villagers wielded everything from rifles and shotguns to farming implements, while improvised barricades and strategic knowledge of mountain passes allowed defenders to create ambushes that inflicted heavy casualties and slowed the German advance. Ordinary citizens, including women and children, contributed by relaying intelligence, supplying food and ammunition, and even directly participating in the defense, their courage blurring the lines between civilian and combatant. Over the course of 7 grueling days, the battle raged across Cretan hills, villages, and coastal approaches, creating a chaotic and intense environment where each skirmish carried significant consequence. The paratroopers, trained for speed and surprise, found themselves vulnerable to determined resistance in unfamiliar terrain, facing relentless counterattacks and ambushes at every turn. The defenders' intimate knowledge of the island's geography proved decisive, as they leveraged narrow paths, high ridges, and rocky outcrops to negate the advantages of superior German weaponry and training. Despite being outnumbered and often outgunned, the Greeks and their allied allies displayed a cohesion and tenacity that confounded the invaders, transforming the airborne operation into a costly endeavor marked by disarray and unexpectedly high losses. The psychological impact of the resistance was equally profound. German paratroopers, accustomed to rapid, overwhelming victories in previous campaigns, were met with an unyielding resolve that challenged their assumptions about occupation and dominance. The sight of local civilians engaging in combat, combined with the resolute defense mounted by the Greek and Allied forces, created a climate of uncertainty and fear that tempered the operational confidence of the invaders. Reports of pitched battles, in which small groups of villagers or soldiers successfully stalled elite units, circulated among German ranks and illustrated that even the most formidable military forces could be brought low by courage, ingenuity, and intimate knowledge of the terrain. Ultimately, after a week of intense fighting, Crete fell to the Germans. But the cost was staggering. The elite airborne units suffered significant casualties, with thousands of soldiers killed, wounded, or missing, and the invasion, though ultimately successful, revealed the vulnerability of paratrooper-led operations in the face of determined and resourceful resistance. The heavy losses endured during Operation Mercury led Hitler to reconsider the future use of large-scale airborne assaults, underscoring how the courage and determination of defenders could shape strategic military doctrine. For the people of Crete, the battle became a symbol of national pride and resilience, a narrative that highlighted the capacity of ordinary citizens and soldiers to alter the course of a seemingly inevitable conquest. The battle also reflected the broader dynamics of Greek resistance during the occupation. Even as the mainland struggled under German, Italian, and Bulgarian control, the story of Crete exemplified the potential for localized, collective action to resist oppression, and it inspired the emerging resistance movements across the rest of Greece. News of the fierce defense reached mainland populations, reinforcing the belief that occupation was neither absolute nor unassailable, and that coordinated efforts between soldiers and civilians could disrupt even the most meticulously planned military operations. This synergy between professional forces and local participants became a hallmark of subsequent partisan activity, providing both tactical lessons and a moral blueprint for sustained resistance. Civilian involvement on Crete, in particular, demonstrated a unique form of agency during wartime. Individuals who had never held formal military positions suddenly became essential contributors to the defense effort, using knowledge of the terrain, improvisational tactics, and sheer courage to counter a technologically superior foe. Families hid weapons, transmitted intelligence, and sometimes confronted German troops directly, with acts of bravery that blurred the conventional boundaries of military engagement. These contributions, while often overshadowed in conventional military histories, were integral to the island's defense and highlighted the complex interplay between social cohesion, local knowledge, and strategic effectiveness in wartime. Strategically, the Battle of Crete had ramifications beyond the island itself. The unexpectedly high German casualties delayed subsequent operations, influenced decisions regarding airborne assaults elsewhere, and provided both the Allies and occupied populations with a case study in the vulnerabilities of mechanized and paratrooper-dependent campaigns. It underscored the necessity of considering local geography, population attitudes, and the determination of defenders when planning military operations, revealing that even elite forces could be impeded by the human and environmental dimensions of conflict. Despite eventual German occupation, the narrative of Crete endured as a testament to courage, resilience, and the capacity of individuals to shape historical events. The defense of the island illustrated how ordinary citizens, when united by a shared commitment to protect their homeland, could challenge one of the most disciplined and feared military forces in the world. It became a story passed down through generations, a symbol of defiance that reinforced national identity and inspired ongoing resistance across Greece during the dark years of occupation. The fierce resistance of Crete, therefore, was more than a military engagement. It was a demonstration of human resilience and collective will. It highlighted the profound impact of civilian participation in warfare, the unpredictability of combat outcomes when determination meets strategy, and the ways in which courage can influence the decisions of even the most formidable adversaries. In remembering Crete, we see a narrative that blends heroism, tragedy, and perseverance, offering lessons not only in military history, but in the enduring power of people united in defense of their homeland. And it sets the stage for understanding the moral and political complexities that would define Greece during the years of occupation and beyond. With the fall of Crete and the collapse of organized Greek and Allied resistance on the mainland, the country was left fragmented and vulnerable, carved into spheres of control that would have profound and devastating consequences for its population. Germany, Italy, and Bulgaria divvied up the nation, establishing occupation zones that reflected both strategic ambitions and opportunistic territorial claims, each with its own administrative apparatus, military presence, and methods of enforcing control. For the Greek people, this division translated into a patchwork of oppression, exploitation, and deprivation, as the mechanisms of occupation extended far beyond simple military dominance to the systematic extraction of resources, suppression of dissent, and imposition of policies designed to subjugate and profit from the conquered population. In the north, German forces concentrated on key urban centers such as Thessalonica, Salonika, and the critical islands of the Aegean, deploying a combination of conventional garrisons, administrative officials, and collaborationist authorities to maintain their grip. These territories were strategically important, both for controlling vital ports and for securing lines of communication with other Axis operations in the Balkans. In practice, the German occupation was characterized by rigid enforcement, compulsory requisition of supplies, and the establishment of puppet administrations, which relied heavily on Greek collaborators to implement policies that often caused immeasurable suffering. The Germans also exploited the local Jewish population, imposing anti-Semitic regulations and ultimately participating in deportations to extermination camps, a tragic consequence that underscored the human cost of occupation beyond military or economic dimensions. Meanwhile, Italy assumed control over much of southern Greece, including Athens, and administered its zones with a mixture of bureaucratic oversight and opportunistic indulgence. Italian forces, while less ruthlessly efficient than their German counterparts, engaged in systematic requisitioning of food, materials, and other resources, leaving ordinary citizens to cope with scarcity and mounting hardship. The occupation disrupted agriculture, trade, and local markets, and combined with the Allied blockade designed to weaken Axis supply chains, created conditions of severe famine that would claim hundreds of thousands of lives. Villages were stripped of livestock, crops were seized, and the most basic goods became luxuries as families struggled to survive in a landscape transformed by war and exploitation. Bulgaria, seeking to expand its territorial ambitions, occupied parts of northern Greece, including regions historically contested along the Macedonian border. Bulgarian administration was characterized by forced assimilation, suppression of local culture, and exploitation of resources, as well as the enforcement of strict population controls to solidify their claims. This multifaceted occupation meant that Greeks living under different authorities experienced distinct but equally harsh realities, and the fragmentation of governance prevented a unified response to the crises that swept the nation, leaving communities isolated and vulnerable to both military and economic pressures. Amid this partition, ordinary Greeks faced the daily realities of survival under a regime that treated them less as citizens and more as a source of revenue, labor, and compliance. Food shortages became increasingly severe, particularly during the winter months, when rationing was insufficient and urban populations found themselves on the brink of starvation. In Thessalonica alone, thousands perished as essential supplies were confiscated or diverted to support Axis military efforts, while other regions witnessed the destruction of villages and the disruption of traditional livelihoods. The occupation also disrupted education, healthcare, and civil services, leaving a generation of children and families exposed to deprivation and insecurity, while creating long-term social and economic scars that would persist well beyond the liberation. The social consequences of this division were profound, as collaborationist governments established under German and Italian influence, such as the puppet regime led by Yannis Rallis, attempted to legitimize their authority while enforcing policies that deepened suffering. Rallis, who justified his collaboration on the grounds of anti-communism, oversaw the creation of the Security Battalions and acquiesced to the extraction of food and goods, actions that provoked widespread resentment and eroded any claim to moral authority. His administration, while nominally Greek, became a tool for the occupying powers, illustrating how political opportunism and ideological motives intersected with the harsh realities of survival under occupation, and how collaboration could exacerbate rather than alleviate the human toll of foreign control. Beyond the political and administrative dimensions, the fragmented occupation fostered an atmosphere of fear, mistrust, and resistance. Partisan groups, often aligned along ideological lines such as nationalist, liberal, or communist, emerged in response to both Axis exploitation and collaborationist repression, launching sabotage operations, intelligence-gathering missions, and occasional attacks on occupying forces. The German and Italian authorities responded with brutal reprisals, executing hostages, destroying villages, and enforcing curfews and rationing, which further intensified civilian suffering while highlighting the complex moral and strategic choices faced by ordinary Greeks trying to navigate the occupation. The interplay between oppression and resistance created a dynamic environment in which survival, loyalty, and defiance were constantly negotiated, and where the boundaries between military and civilian experience became blurred. Economic exploitation was another defining feature of this partitioned occupation. Agricultural production was commandeered to support Axis supply lines. Industrial output was redirected to war-related manufacturing, and financial resources were extracted through taxation, fines, and forced contributions. Families who once relied on subsistence farming or local trade found themselves stripped of assets, unable to secure food, and increasingly dependent on clandestine networks. Black markets, or relief efforts orchestrated by underground resistance groups. Urban centers, in particular, experienced a dramatic transformation, as bustling streets and marketplaces became sites of scarcity, surveillance, and control, and citizens were forced to reconcile the demands of daily survival with the omnipresent threat of reprisal. Culturally and psychologically, the division of Greece under multiple occupations inflicted a deep wound on the national consciousness. Communities were severed by arbitrary borders, historical identities were challenged by imposed authorities, and traditional social structures were disrupted. The looting of cultural artifacts, religious sites, and communal property further compounded the sense of violation and dispossession, while the widespread fear of collaborationist betrayal fostered a climate of suspicion and uncertainty. Yet within this adversity, acts of courage and solidarity emerged, as ordinary Greeks sheltered refugees, smuggled supplies, and maintained clandestine networks to preserve both life and dignity, demonstrating that resilience and humanity could endure even in the darkest circumstances. By the end of the occupation, the consequences of the fragmented control were stark. Famine had claimed tens of thousands of lives, communities were decimated, and the nation's infrastructure lay in ruins. Yet the collective memory of these experiences forged a powerful narrative of endurance, resistance, and identity. The division among Germany, Italy, and Bulgaria not only facilitated immediate exploitation but also set the stage for post-war challenges, including political instability, social fragmentation, and the complex moral reckoning with collaboration and resistance. In this environment, the Greek experience during the occupation became both a cautionary tale of human suffering under foreign domination and an enduring testament to the capacity of ordinary people to adapt, resist, and survive in the face of overwhelming adversity. Through this lens, the story of Greece under partitioned occupation illuminates the interplay between strategy, exploitation, and resilience, illustrating how a nation can be subjected to external control, internal collaboration, and devastating deprivation, yet still cultivate acts of courage and solidarity that define its historical and cultural legacy. It is a story of tragedy and endurance, a vivid reminder of the human cost of war, and a reflection on the moral, social, and political complexities that arise when a country is carved into spheres of influence by competing powers. Amid the devastation and despair that engulfed Greece under the fractured control of Germany, Italy, and Bulgaria, a powerful undercurrent of defiance began to emerge, one that would come to define both the moral and practical resistance to the Axis occupation. Across the mountains, forests, and villages of the Greek countryside, clandestine movements formed with a singular purpose: to resist, sabotage, and undermine the mechanisms of oppression that had brought famine, destruction, and fear to their homeland. Among these groups, the National Liberation Front, known by its Greek acronym, and its military arm, Hellas, distinguished themselves as the most organized and effective, drawing primarily on communist ideology while encompassing a diverse spectrum of fighters united by the desire to liberate their country. Unlike conventional armies, these partisans operated in secrecy, relying on knowledge of the terrain, local support networks, and a combination of improvisation and meticulous planning to strike at the occupiers in ways that disrupted their control and showcased the resilience of the Greek people. From the outset, Gellus recognized that open confrontation with the heavily armed Axis forces was both impractical and potentially catastrophic. Instead, their strategy emphasized sabotage, intelligence gathering, and the orchestration of small, targeted strikes designed to weaken the enemy's infrastructure while conserving their own strength. Railways, supply depots, and communication lines became focal points for these operations, with partisan teams often risking their lives to derail trains, destroy bridges, or cut telegraph lines, slowing the movement of troops and supplies and forcing the occupiers to divert resources to security and repair. The impact of these actions went beyond mere physical disruption. They served as psychological blows, signaling that, despite the overwhelming military presence of the Axis, the Greek people remained unbroken and capable of resistance. The mountainous terrain of Greece offered both sanctuary and strategic advantage for these movements. Villages hidden in valleys and mountain passes provided safe havens where fighters could regroup, store weapons, and coordinate operations without immediate detection. Local populations played a critical role, offering shelter, food, and intelligence, often at great personal risk, as collaborationist authorities and occupying troops sought to root out dissent. The symbiotic relationship between civilians and partisans was a defining feature of the resistance. Ordinary Greeks became essential participants in the struggle, facilitating escape routes for operatives, conveying information about enemy movements, and sometimes engaging directly in combat. In many, the success of Gellus relied as much on this local support network as on the fighters themselves, highlighting the interplay between community cohesion and military effectiveness in an occupied nation. Gellus also faced a complex web of internal and external challenges that shaped the trajectory of their operations. While unified by the goal of opposing the Axis, The broader Greek resistance landscape was fragmented, encompassing nationalist, liberal, and other ideological factions whose priorities sometimes conflicted with those of the communist-led groups. Coordination, negotiation, and occasional rivalry defined these relationships, as each group sought both to contribute to the national struggle and to position itself advantageously for the uncertain post-war future. The British Special Operations Executive, recognizing the strategic value of resistance movements, sought to mediate and support these factions, providing training, weapons, and operational guidance while encouraging collaboration against the occupiers. One notable instance was Operation Harling, targeting the railway viaduct at Gorgotamos, where Greek partisans, working alongside British operatives, successfully sabotaged a critical supply line, demonstrating the effectiveness of coordinated action and the tangible impact of resistance efforts on the broader war effort. Beyond the tangible acts of sabotage, Eames cultivated an intricate underground infrastructure that encompassed propaganda, political education, and governance in liberated or contested areas. They established clandestine schools, communication networks, and supply chains that not only sustained their fighters, but also provided a semblance of order and civic structure in areas beyond the immediate reach of Axis control. This dual focus on military action and civil organization underscored a broader vision, that resistance was not merely about survival or disruption, but also about shaping the future of Greece, asserting both ideological principles and practical capabilities that would influence post-occupation governance. The human cost of these operations was immense, as partisans faced constant danger from superior enemy forces and brutal reprisals against both fighters and civilians. Axis troops frequently responded to sabotage with punitive measures, including mass executions, village burnings, and arrests, aiming to intimidate the population and deter further resistance. These reprisals, while devastating, often had the opposite effect, reinforcing the resolve of partisans and civilians alike and fostering a collective identity grounded in shared sacrifice. The courage exhibited by fighters, many of whom were young and inexperienced, and by the communities that supported them, became a defining element of Greece's wartime narrative, highlighting the interplay between personal bravery, a communal solidarity, and strategic acumen in shaping the outcomes of conflict. In addition to direct military actions, the operations of Eames had a significant impact on the broader political landscape of occupied Greece. Their activities challenged the legitimacy of collaborationist authorities, disrupted the administration of German, Italian, and Bulgarian zones, and created pressure on the occupying forces to divert resources from frontline operations to internal security. These efforts not only hampered Axis logistical capabilities, but also served as a constant reminder that occupation could never be total or uncontested, and that even in the darkest periods, the will to resist remained a potent force. The story of Eames also illustrates the complex moral terrain of wartime resistance. Decisions made by partisan leaders often involve difficult trade-offs between strategic necessity and the risk to civilian populations, between immediate tactical gains and long-term political objectives. Yet despite these challenges, the consistent thread was a commitment to undermine the occupation and assert Greek agency in a situation designed to suppress it, demonstrating how ideology, strategy, and morality intersected in the lived experience of resistance. Ultimately, the clandestine operations of Eames and other resistance groups left an enduring legacy that extended far beyond the tactical successes of sabotage missions. They exemplified the resilience of an occupied population, the power of coordinated action, and the capacity of ordinary individuals to influence the course of events through courage, ingenuity, and unwavering commitment. The activities of these partisans were not merely acts of defiance against a military adversary. They were expressions of national identity, a communal solidarity, and the enduring human drive for freedom, shaping both the course of World War II in Greece and the collective memory of a nation determined to reclaim its sovereignty. The narrative of Yannis, therefore, is one of strategic brilliance intertwined with moral courage, of ordinary citizens transformed into agents of liberation, and of a nation asserting its resilience in the face of overwhelming adversity. It reminds us that even under the most oppressive circumstances, the determination of people united by purpose can challenge, disrupt, and ultimately shape the forces that seek to dominate them, offering a powerful testament to the enduring strength of human resolve and the multifaceted nature of resistance during wartime. As Greece languished under the iron grip of Axis occupation, the role of collaborationist leaders became a defining, and often tragic, element of the nation's wartime experience, none more controversial than that of Yannis Rallis, whose actions would leave an indelible mark on both the history and conscience of the country. Rallis, already steeped in the traditions of Greek political life, rose to prominence as a man who sought to navigate the treacherous waters of occupation with a singular aim: the suppression of communism. Yet this ostensibly political motivation led him down a path that intertwined with some of the most horrific consequences of the war, as he lent support, tacitly and overtly, to the machinery of oppression deployed by Nazi authorities in Greece. The collaboration he orchestrated was not limited to administrative compliance or superficial governance. It extended to active endorsement of policies that devastated entire communities, particularly the Jewish populations of Thessalonica and Athens, cities that had once flourished as centers of culture, commerce, and coexistence. In Thessalonica, a city with a Jewish community that had thrived for centuries, the arrival of German forces marked the beginning of an inexorable decline. Rallis, government, functioning under the watchful eye of the occupiers, facilitated the systematic stripping of civil rights and property, creating a bureaucratic framework that allowed Nazi officials to implement anti-Jewish measures with chilling efficiency. Synagogues and cultural institutions were shuttered, businesses expropriated, and everyday life rendered precarious by ordinances designed to segregate, humiliate, and isolate the Jewish population. As winter deepened, the human cost became tragically apparent. Families were corralled into temporary holding centers, subjected to forced labor, and eventually herded into railway cars under inhumane conditions. The deportations were swift and merciless. Tens of thousands of men, women, and children were sent to extermination camps in Poland, where the machinery of genocide claimed lives with terrifying finality. Rallis' administrative acquiescence, and in many instances direct facilitation, allowed these operations to proceed with efficiency, implicating his government in a chain of events that would decimate a once vibrant community. Athens, too, became a theater of anguish and moral compromise under Rallis' stewardship. Here, the Jewish population initially found a slightly more ambiguous space, as local networks and sympathetic individuals attempted to shield neighbors from the full brunt of Nazi persecution. However, as the war progressed and German control expanded into previously Italian-held zones, Rallis' collaboration took on a darker hue. He supported the occupiers' policies in ways that undermined the protective efforts of local citizens, enabling roundups, confiscations, and forced relocations that placed thousands in mortal danger. The moral tightrope Rallis claimed to walk, balancing his anti-communist objective with an ostensible concern for Greek civilians, collapsed in the face of actions that directly abetted the persecution of fellow Greeks, reducing the population to victims of hunger, fear, and systemic violence. Ordinary Athenians watched as neighbors and friends were forced into hiding, some escaping to mountain strongholds, others disappearing entirely, leaving behind a void of grief that would echo long after the occupation ended. Rallis' decisions were entwined with the broader machinery of the Nazi occupation, a system that combined strategic exploitation of resources with ideological terror to maintain dominance. Under his administration, the Security Battalions, initially intended to suppress communist insurgents, became instruments of intimidation and control, enforcing Nazi policies through fear and brutality. The same organizational infrastructure that facilitated anti-resistance activities was repurposed, indirectly or directly, to support the rounding up of Jewish citizens, showing how collaboration extended beyond formal decrees to the very operational mechanisms of the occupation. Administrative orders, records, and local enforcement all contributed to a system in which resistance and survival became intertwined with the moral compromises of daily life, illustrating how the decisions of one political figure could ripple across a society already strained by famine, warfare, and occupation. Yet within this grim tableau, there were moments of resistance and subversion, where citizens, religious leaders, and even low-level officials sought to mitigate the harm caused by both occupiers and collaborators. In Athens, Archbishop Damaskinos and other community figures organized networks to shelter Jews, provide false documents, and facilitate escapes to safer regions, often risking their own safety in the process. While these efforts saved lives, they also highlighted the stark contrast between the choices of Rallis, who operated within the corridors of power to facilitate Nazi objectives, and those who acted from moral conviction to resist injustice, showing that collaboration and conscience coexisted within the same occupied landscape in profoundly consequential ways. The deportations and systemic oppression in Thessalonica and Athens were not isolated events, but part of a broader pattern of exploitation and terror that swept across Greece, where economic deprivation, forced labor, and cultural suppression compounded the already immense suffering caused by military occupation. Rallis' government, by aligning with Nazi policies, became a conduit for these atrocities, enabling a scale of harm that went beyond immediate military objectives to encompass the destruction of communities and the erasure of cultural heritage. The consequences were staggering: thousands of lives lost, families torn apart, and social networks obliterated, leaving scars that would endure for generations. Historians and commentators have debated Rallis' motives, some emphasizing his anti-communist stance as the driving force behind his choices, others highlighting the moral failure inherent in collaborating with a regime committed to genocide. What is undeniable, however, is that his actions facilitated, rather than hindered, some of the most tragic chapters of the Holocaust in Greece, implicating his administration in the systemic persecution of civilians who had no stake in the ideological battles that consumed Europe. The juxtaposition of strategic intent and moral consequence offers a cautionary tale about the dangers of prioritizing political objectives over human life, illustrating how decisions made under duress can magnify suffering when ethical considerations are subordinated to perceived expediency. Ultimately, the story of Rallis' collaboration underscores the profound human costs of occupation, the ethical dilemmas faced by leaders, and the resilience of communities that sought to survive and resist despite overwhelming adversity. It is a narrative of complicity and courage, of choices that shape the destiny of cities and citizens, and of the enduring importance of moral judgment in times of crisis. By examining the tragic impact of his actions in Thessalonica and Athens, we gain a deeper understanding of how occupation, collaboration, and resistance interwove to define the lived experience of Greece during one of its darkest hours, providing lessons about leadership, accountability, and the human capacity for both harm and heroism even in the most dire circumstances. As the guns fell silent across Greece and the smoke of battle cleared, the nation emerged from the ruins of occupation to confront a new and unexpected conflict, one that would test the very foundations of its society and political identity. The devastation wrought by years of famine, forced labor, mass deportations, and the ruthless suppression of resistance had left a country fractured, its people exhausted yet determined to rebuild. Yet the liberation from Axis forces did not bring immediate peace. Instead, Greece found itself on the brink of another war, this time a civil war born not of foreign occupation but of ideological struggle, as competing visions for the nation's future clashed violently across towns, villages, and mountain passes, the divisions that had simmered during the occupation. Between monarchists, nationalists, communists, and other political factions, now erupted into open confrontation, with each side vying not just for power but for the very soul of post-war Greece. In this turbulent landscape, the legacy of Yannis Rallis remained a source of both controversy and clarity. His collaboration with the Axis powers, motivated by a fervent anti-communist ideology, had long left deep scars on the nation. After the war, the judicial system sought to reckon with the moral and legal consequences of his choices, and Rallis was tried for his role in facilitating the occupiers' policies, including acts that had contributed to the suffering and deaths of countless civilians. The trial, held in 1946, culminated in a sentence of life imprisonment, a formal recognition of the magnitude of his collaboration and a symbolic assertion of justice by a nation seeking to rebuild its moral and political framework. Rallis' imprisonment marked the end of his direct influence on Greek affairs, but the consequences of his actions continued to reverberate through the country's social, political, and cultural life. At the same time, the broader question of Greece's political future remained unresolved. Resistance movements such as invaders, which had played a critical role in undermining Axis occupation, were now key actors in the struggle for post-war governance. Their ideological commitment to communism brought them into direct conflict with Western-backed forces, particularly as the British sought to ensure that Greece would not fall under a communist regime in the emerging post-war balance of power. What followed was a brutal and protracted civil war, which lasted from 1946 to 1949, claiming thousands of lives and leaving vast regions of the country scarred by violence, displacement, and destruction. The Civil War was not merely a political contest. It was also a human tragedy. As neighbors, former allies, and even family members found themselves on opposing sides, bound by ideology, circumstance, and survival. Despite the intensity of the conflict, the intervention of Western-backed forces proved decisive. Military support, strategic guidance, and financial aid enabled the government to suppress communist insurgents and reassert control over contested territories. By 1949, the civil war had largely subsided, leaving Greece under a government aligned with Western interests and a society that, while battered, had preserved its democratic institutions and sovereignty. The defeat of the communist forces marked the end of an era of ideological upheaval, solidifying the political trajectory of Greece within the broader context of post-war Europe and the emerging Cold War. Reflecting on this period, it becomes clear that the story of Greece during and after World War II is one of profound resilience and complex moral choices. The nation endured unspeakable suffering under occupation, yet ordinary citizens, resistance fighters, and even those operating within morally ambiguous spaces demonstrated remarkable courage, ingenuity, and determination. Leaders like Rallis illustrate the consequences of prioritizing ideology or expediency over humanitarian and ethical imperatives. while the actions of resistance movements highlight the capacity for collective action to challenge oppression and assert human dignity even in the darkest circumstances. Greece's post-war trajectory, shaped by both internal struggles and international interventions, underscores the interplay between local agency and global geopolitics, reminding us that history is often the product of both individual choices and broader structural forces. As we close this chapter of history, it is important to remember the lessons it offers for contemporary audiences: the dangers of ideological extremism, the moral responsibility of leadership, and the enduring power of human resilience in the face of systemic oppression. It reminds us that freedom and justice are rarely won without sacrifice, and that the legacies of collaboration, resistance, and conflict continue to shape societies long after the final battles have ended. By examining the choices of individuals and the collective actions of communities, we gain insights not only into the past, but also into the ethical and practical considerations that continue to resonate in the present. Thank you for joining us on this journey through one of Greece's most challenging and transformative periods. Your support allows us to continue exploring history with nuance, depth, and respect for the complexities that define our shared human experience. If you found this story compelling, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with others who are curious about the lessons of history, as every view helps us keep these important narratives alive and accessible. By engaging with history in this way, we honor those who lived it and ensure that their experiences inform the choices of future generations. As the night draws to a close, may the courage and resilience of those who endured inspire reflection and gratitude. Rest well, and may your dreams carry the hope and lessons of those who fought to preserve freedom, justice, and the dignity of the human spirit. Good night, and thank you once again for being part of this journey.